spent 11 years walking beside the reckoning wagons, and in all that time I never once looked back after a name was struck. That was the job. You carried a rifle you never had to use, because nobody argues with the accountancy in the open, and you kept your eyes forward while the registrar's clerks read the ledger aloud and the unwritten were led off to wherever the convoy took them. I told myself the forward-looking was mercy. It let people believe the wagons went somewhere kind. The season they came to Hallows Bend, I was 44 years old and tired in the specific way a man gets when he's spent a long career protecting a process instead of a person. The town sits where the river bends hard around a stone shoulder, cobbles slick year-round with spray, and the accountancy always stopped there because the crossing made a natural funnel, easy to count a town when it can only leave one road at a time. The girl was already under the registrar's own supply cart when I found her, wedged behind a water barrel with her knees to her chest, marsh-born, by the webbing at her fingers and the faint algae sheen along her hairline, though someone had scrubbed most of it off her arms in a hurry. Her family's name had been read an hour before. Struck, the clerk had said, for an old debt entered wrong 3 registries back. The kind of clerical rot nobody fixes because fixing it helps no one but the person it was done to. They'd taken her mother and her uncle onto the wagons. They had not taken her. Somewhere in the noise of loading, she'd gone under the cart instead of into it, and nobody had counted the gap. I could have called it in. That was the job too. Anyone unwritten and unaccounted for was a discrepancy, and discrepancies got found. I looked at her instead. She looked back at me steady, none of the crying I expected, just a kind of exhausted watchfulness, like she'd already worked out that whatever I decided in the next 10 seconds was the whole of her future. Stay small, I told her, which wasn't a plan, just the only true thing I had. Then I walked away from the cart like I hadn't seen anything, and my hands did not stop shaking for an hour. I got her into my quarters above the smithy that night wrapped in a horse blanket, and I did not sleep. The accountancy doesn't leave a crossing town in a day. They linger a week minimum, cross-checking the ledger against the local roll, making sure nothing slipped. A week is a long time to keep a girl invisible in a street where everyone knows everyone's business. Her name was Wren, she told me on the second day, in the flat, careful voice of a child who has learned that information is currency and hers had already cost her a family. I didn't ask what she'd been before the ledger struck her people. I taught her instead. How to walk like she had somewhere ordinary to be. How to hold a market basket so her hands stayed hidden. How to answer if anyone asked whose girl she was. My niece, visiting from upriver, I told her to say, and she practiced the lie in a whisper until it came out steady. She was quiet in the way of someone carrying something too heavy to set down, and afraid that if she cried it would slip and break. Once, folding a shirt of mine that swallowed her to the elbow, she asked if her mother would be provisioned for, on the wagons, and I told her yes, because I did not know, and because the alternative was a cruelty I wasn't going to hand a child on top of everything else the ledger had already taken from her. She held a small cracked slate, a scrap of her mother's old tallying slate, the kind Marsh families used to keep their own private count of things worth remembering, and she'd trace the chalked names on it at night like a woman saying a rosary. I never asked her to put it down. The head registrar was a woman named Austral Vane, sharp as a filed blade, and good at her work in the particular way that made her dangerous. She didn't hate anyone. She simply believed absolutely that the ledger's math was cleaner than the world's, and that made her merciless in a way real cruelty rarely manages. By the 4th day, she'd noticed the gap in her own count. 1 family struck, 3 names read onto the wagons, and somewhere in her tally a 4th had existed and stopped existing on paper without a corresponding entry anywhere else. She started asking questions in the street with the patient thoroughness of someone who intends to find an answer. She came to my door on the 6th night, and she didn't waste time pretending it was a social call. She asked, plainly, whether I'd seen a marsh-born girl matching a description she gave down to the webbing on the girl's hands. I told her no. She looked past me into the room, where Wren sat very still at the table with a needle and thread, doing exactly what I'd taught her to do, which was look like nothing worth a second glance. "Whose girl is that?" Austral asked, and there was no accusation in it yet, only the beginning of one. I had maybe 2 seconds to decide what kind of man I was going to be for the rest of my life, and I want to say I thought it through, weighed the accountancy's reach, considered what it would cost me to lie to a registrar's face with a witness in the room. I didn't. I said the truth instead of the rehearsed lie, because the lie wouldn't hold past tomorrow, and the truth might. "She's mine," I said. "Written this morning. Into my own household. Corin Vass's ward, under my name, my provision, my account. Check it against the town roll if you like." I filed it with the magistrate at first light. I hadn't. Not until that exact moment did the idea even finish forming. But I'd been a reckoning man for 11 years, And I knew the one thing the accountancy could never do without breaking its own foundation. It could not unwrite a filing made in good order before witnesses, not without opening every ledger it had ever signed to the same question. A struck name was final. A written one, filed clean, was also final. The whole system depended on both directions holding, or none of it held at all. Austral Vane stood in my doorway a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite doubt and wasn't quite defeat. Closer to a woman running the sums twice and getting the same answer she didn't want. She could have torn the filing apart with enough effort. She could have called it fraud and made it cost me everything. I watched her decide it wasn't worth what it would take. That one clerical irregularity in a lonely river town wasn't worth dragging the accountancy's own precedent into daylight where 100 other quiet men might notice how the trick was done. Have it witnessed by the magistrate properly by morning, she said, or I come back with the whole convoy, and she left. And that was the entire shape of the wrath the ledger ever showed us. No fire, no wagons at my door, no reckoning beyond a door closing harder than it needed to. I understood even then that I'd been given a mercy she didn't have to offer, and that she'd offered it because some part of her math had come out, quietly, on the side of a girl who deserved better than being struck for a debt she never owed. I filed it properly the next morning. Renvass, Ward, under my name, my roof, my account, in ink that would outlast both of us if the paper held. She kept the cracked slate. I never made her explain it, and she never offered to. Some nights I'd hear her tracing the old names on it in the dark, and I let her, because a person is allowed to keep the dead close in whatever shape fits in one hand. She's grown now, long past the age where anyone could argue the filing, and she still keeps that slate on a shelf where she can see it. I keep the memory of Austral Vane's face in that doorway. The exact moment a whole cruel, orderly system found itself outmatched not by force but by one clean entry in a book it had taught me too well how to read. I was never anyone's hero. I was a tired man who knew where the seams in a machine were, and who decided, once, to use that knowledge for a person instead of a process. Some nights that's the only kind of wrath worth having. Not fire, not vengeance, just a name that could not be struck twice.